Hello, my name is Richard White, and I'm Emeritus Professor of American History at Stanford University. And I want to welcome you to today's session on Cameron Blevins' new book, Paper Trails. And the session is, of course, at the Bill Lane Center for the American West. I'm just going to give a short introduction because I want to leave most of the time for Cameron and for the discussion of the book. But Cameron is an assistant professor of history and digital humanities at the University of Colorado, Denver. And he, through his new book, Paper Trails, which is what he's going to talk about today, has probably done more to bring attention to the importance of the post office than anybody except for Louis DeJoy. Cameron is a Stanford PhD, and as you will see, the post office is both his subject and his tool. He uses it to illuminate how the American state expanded and within a generation in the 19th century took control of and integrated into the country as a whole, a vast section of the West that had been Indian country. Cameron's work is innovative, and it's innovative in its interpretations, but it's also innovative in technique. He's one of the first history graduate students to take advantage of the Spatial History Lab, which is now part of CESTA here at Stanford, and his own work very much helped to shape it. What Cameron does is historicize space, and if you don't know what that means, you should know by the end of the hour. So I will leave that up to Cameron to explain. Engaging him in discussion today is Charlotte Hull, who is currently what Cameron once was, a Thomas Dee II Graduate Fellow at the Bill Lane Center. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to submit your questions as they occur to you, and I will sort through them to be at the end of the session for Cameron to answer. But don't wait till the end to submit them. It's easier to organize them if you submit them as they occur to you. So at this point, I'm just simply going to turn this over to Charlotte and Cameron. Or excuse me, not to Charlotte, to Cameron. First you hear from Cameron, then you'll hear from Charlotte and Cameron.
All right, thank you, Richard, for that introduction. And also, obviously, thank you to the Bill Lane Center and the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. This is kind of where the project first started, so it's really nice to be able to, at least virtually, come back to the roots. And then also thank you to Charlotte for agreeing very generously to facilitate this. And we're basically just going to engage in a bit of a Q&A here. And then like Richard said, at the end, we'll collect questions and have about 20 minutes or so to respond to those. So I'll actually hand things over to Charlotte to get things started.
All right. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Cameron. It is wonderful to be here today, and I'm so excited to get to talk to you about your new book. So I have loads of questions, so we'll see how far we get before we open it up for the audience. So my first question is, your new book, Paper Trails, is the story of the expansion of the US state power during the late 19th century and the expansion of the US Post into the American West during this period. So why have historians largely overlooked the role of the post office in the story of US expansion?
I think there's a couple reasons for this. Probably at the biggest level, I think generally it's just really easy to take large networks and systems and infrastructure for granted. And that's especially true when you see them everywhere and every day. So I think we've got currently 119 people on this Zoom webinar right now. I'm guessing very few of you are thinking to yourselves, wait a second, I'm 1,000 miles away from Denver, Colorado. How in the world is this even possible? And we've gotten so accustomed to this kind of communication platform over the past 15 months that we don't necessarily stop to think about what sorts of physical infrastructure, the hardware, the software, what sorts of regulatory systems and apparatus needs to go into place to allow a video of me and my slowly dying houseplant in the background to magically appear in real time on the screen of hundreds of people. But second, I think, and a lot more specifically to the American West, a lot of us have been taught to essentially not see government when it comes to the West. Right? This is a region that is steeped in this idea of rugged individualism and self-reliance, stories about cowboys and Indians and pioneers and covered wagons. This is not a story about big government. And in fact, in many ways, it's explicitly a story that is anti-government. Historians, however, have been pushing back against this idea for the past 40 years or so. This includes notoriously grumpy, fun-hating historians like Richard White, who came along and said, wait a minute, government was everywhere in the West, right? You can't roll a tumbleweed without hitting some kind of government project. This is the region of federal dams and reservoirs and nuclear weapons testing, Bureau of Land Management, the National Park System, military bases, defense contracts, on and on and on. The West has really been a region that's shaped by these big government initiatives. But even there, I think there remains this tendency to really focus on particular kinds of government. In particular, for the 1800s in the West, we look at the most visible and muscular forms of government. And in this case, it would be the government's violent campaigns against the region's native people. And so over the course of several decades in the 1800s, the US Army effectively waged war against Western tribes, forcibly seized their land, removed them, confined them onto a system of government reservations. This is the central story of the American West. But I think what's missing from that story is then how and why so many American settlers were then able to occupy what was stolen native land. And we're able to do so in such a short period of time. And this is where the US Post starts to come into play. So no matter where US settlers moved, no matter how far away it was, how remote a location, they were still able to stay connected to the world they left behind. And so if you're moving to a ranch in Nevada, a mining camp in Montana, you can still count on the US Post to follow you, to have a post office nearby, to carry you letters from your sister or newspapers from Chicago. And so to return to that first point about all of us kind of taking something like Zoom for granted, it's really only when I stopped taking the US Post for granted, when I paused to actually ask that question, wait a second, right? This is absolutely insane. How in the world are all of these people scattered across all these remote locations able to communicate with all of these distant places? And that's only when I started to understand just how important the US Post was within this larger story of the American West and the federal government.
Okay, thank you. And since you mentioned Zoom and technology, I'm going to lean into that and ask you a little bit about digital history. So how do digital history methods differ from conventional historical methods, and how do digital methods reveal themes and patterns, stories like the US Post, that more conventional approaches might miss?
So in the spirit of digital history, I am going to share my screen. I've been doing this for the last 15 months, so hopefully I can actually figure out how to do this. Okay, I think everyone should be able to see a bunch of letters on your screen. So if we think about conventional history, obviously to completely oversimplify, historians spend a lot of time in archives reading old stuff, right? We read letters, reports, diaries, all sorts of documents. And digital history takes a lot of different forms. But one of the ones that I ended up using a lot of would be to try to figure out taking some of these historical documents and then analyzing them computationally in some way. And so if you think of a kind of traditional approach to history, if we are looking at the US Post, for instance, we could read letters. We could also read something like the annual report from the Postmaster General. This is really, really fascinating reading, let me tell you. 800 pages each year, a federal report. You can see quotes like this, right? Saying that the post office is the most visible form of the federal government to every community, to every citizen, and one that serves every neighborhood. Or you could read other stuff later on in the report, such as that there are about 59,000 post offices operating in the United States. The challenge that I think with this conventional approach is sometimes it can be hard to wrap your head around, what does this mean, right? What does every neighborhood mean? What does 59,000 post office mean? Is that a lot? Is that a little? And digital methods give you one way to try to approach this from a slightly different perspective. And so, for instance, you could collect statistics to compare the US Post to other national postal systems. So that year that the Postmaster General said this, 59,000 post offices. This is comparing the size of that network. So the y-axis is the number of post offices. The x-axis is the length of the number of mail routes within the nation. And you can see over here on the right, the United States is a massive outlier. It's about 2 to 3 times as large as any other postal system in the world. Or you can visualize those numbers a little bit differently. You can, for instance, put them onto a map. In the case of the US Post, when you stop to map the geography of something like 59,000 post offices, you start to get a real sense for what it means to have a post office in, quote, every neighborhood or every community. It starts to become a lot more literal and begins to open up different avenues for understanding how this network spread and operated. So this is an animated map of the expansion of the American postal system over the course of the 1800s, and in light gray is unceded native land. In dark gray, eventually showing up, are the growth of government reservations. What you're able to see is a couple different things. One, how the US Post basically went hand in hand with native dispossession, the ability to expand really rapidly into stolen native territory. But then also, this animation that I just showed is showing how quickly and dynamic this system really was. The ability of the Post to expand in this, so quickly over the course of years or decades. And I think this opened up for me some bigger insights into what this network was, how it expanded, how it operated, and its relationship to some of these larger processes such as native dispossession and settler expansion into the West. And then I want to say also for digital history, all of this was made possible by a stamp collector who I never got to meet. His name was Richard Hellbach, but spent decades of his life collecting records of post offices that operated in the United States, and eventually compiled a database of about 166,000 records that I was then able to use to create a lot of this, these visualizations here. So he would take this kind of handwritten microfilm and then transform that into a format that's usable for me. And this opens up to larger questions about the idea of kind of labor within digital history and how data gets made that I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A.
All right, thank you. Well, I'll just ask you a follow-up question on that. Since you showed us those gorgeous letters and the Hellbach data set, and I'm wondering, could you give us a sense of what researching this book at the Bill Lane Center and at SESTA actually looked like? In other words, how did you convert this data, all of the many forms of data that you collected, into a book?
Right, so I think anyone that's worked with data, especially historical data, has probably learned it takes a long time. It is messy, it's difficult, you're gonna run into all sorts of challenges. I tell this to my students all the time. It will take longer than you think. And doing that as a graduate student, I was extremely lucky to have the kind of institutional support where that was possible. A lot of folks don't. So getting to the point of having these, animated maps that I can show on a computer screen took years and years of work. And some of this involved learning technical skills, so things like, ArcGIS mapping software, how to program in the language R. But more importantly, I think as a graduate student in particular, having institutional support of a place like SESTA, the Spatial History Lab, and the Lane Center gave me the space to actually do this kind of stuff. And I know it's starting to change, but there's still a lot of programs in which if you want to do this kind of digital work, there's a lot of skepticism, and you find yourself expending a lot of time and energy trying to justify why this approach is worthwhile. And that really never happened to me at Stanford. And I was extremely privileged to be able to do that. I also think more concretely, of course, there was real institutional opportunities that I had. So I was able to collaborate with a bunch of people at Stanford, actually working in the Stanford Literary Lab for a couple of years, learning kind of different digital method approaches to things. I was able to collaborate with an academic technology specialist at the time named Jason Hepler, phenomenal historian, to build an interactive website that maps some of these post offices, kind of an early prototype. And then at the Spatial History Lab, I ended up being able to work with some really, really talented research assistants, Tara Balakrishnan, Jenny Barron, Dina Hassan, Jocelyn Hickox, Alex Ramsey, and Varun Vijay, who helped with different aspects of data collection and processing.
Okay. So let's turn now actually to some of the central stories in the book. And one thing that really stuck out to me as I was reading this was a couple of your key terms. So I had never thought of the US Post Office or the American state in terms of textiles before. Could you tell us about how you came up with the phrase Gossamer network, which is also, by the way, the name of your companion website, which we'll get to in a moment. So could you tell us about the phrase Gossamer network to describe the character of the US postal system in the late 19th century American West, and how Gossamer network relates to one of your other key terms, which is the agency model?
I'm mostly laughing because for a while in there, that was the working title of my book, was Gossamer Network, until many people pointed out to me that you probably don't want to name a book something that a bunch of your readers are not going to actually know the meaning of the word, which fortunately we managed to find a different title for the book. But the idea of a Gossamer network, right? So Gossamer, gauzy, lightweight, kind of delicate material, even ephemeral. And the reason why I chose this particular term is that it offers a really different interpretation and imagery for a big federal institution. This is not a descriptor that we tend to associate with the federal government. And the reason why I eventually arrived at this term was in fact looking at archival material and the data itself. So looking at post office records from the 1800s, I kept being struck again and again by seeing post offices that effectively sprung up and then disappeared within a matter of months. This is an example from Arizona. The Esperanza post office was established in February, and then 8 months later in October was discontinued, disappeared, right? And if you look at the data set, the larger data set of post offices, you see that every single year, hundreds and hundreds of post offices are either shutting down or changing their names or locations, right? So this is 1885, 1886, and in red, you're seeing post offices that are effectively shutting down, discontinuing, or changing names or locations. This is a network that is both expanding really quickly, but also contracting in all of these different places at the same time. And this was especially true in the American West. And in fact, over the course of the 1800s, a little less than about 40% of all post offices that were opened up in the West only stayed open for less than 10 years before they either shut down or again changed names or locations. This is a really unstable network. And it's kind of what I mean by Gossamer, again, being able to kind of weave out these tendrils into distant places, but then also withdraw them as well. And that web of connections is not necessarily as stable as we might think. I think all of this, right, begs the question, like the Esperanza post office, what is happening here? What is going on, right? How in the world does this thing even work? And that's what led me to the second, more conceptual idea for the book, which is the concept of an agency model of government and of organization. The agency model is what powered this Gossamer network, especially in the American countryside and rural parts of the country. And the idea behind this is that you have a basic problem. If you're a big organization, public or private, how do you provide service across a really large geographical area? And there are different strategies to do this, but in the 19th century, one of the big ways that I realized was what I'm terming the agency model. I don't mean this in terms of the kind of drug enforcement agency, but more in the sense of relying on local agents to perform some kind of service. So in this case, it would be a labor force that is decentralized. So you got all these people scattered across the country, operating with kind of minimal centralized supervision. They're also oftentimes private actors. So you have this public service of mail being grafted onto existing private businesses. They're also temporary, part-time. You see people dropping out and in of this workforce, and then also working only part-time on the mail. And then finally, they're not salaried. They're not paid a full salary, but they work on this idea of commissions, fees, and contracts. And I should say that I also borrowed this concept of the agency in particular from a wonderful historian who I was able to work with at Stanford Natalie Marine Street, who has worked on this idea of the agency model in the private sector. And I realized I was seeing this all over the place in the public sector as well. So if we think about the 19th century post, it looks a lot different than it does today. So rather than these kind of uniformed mail carriers with these sweet uniforms driving, government vehicles. Actually, side note, I just learned apparently these mail trucks are like hated by mail carriers universally. They're super uncomfortable. They don't have air conditioning and they don't have airbags. So they're currently working to basically revamp the entire fleet in the next couple of years. Fun fact for you. So instead, again, of these kind of full-time public employees, the US postal system would pay stagecoach companies to carry a couple bags of mail alongside passengers or freight to all of these rural locations. And they paid them based on a contract system that was temporary, usually for about 4 years. Or if we compare it to a US post office today, this is our local post office in North Denver that I go to. Probably looks familiar for a lot of you, right? Kind of a single building that is dedicated to a single thing, and that's a post office. And if you go inside, you're going to see, again, uniformed employees working behind the counter as public officials paid by the federal government. That's not what the US Post looked like in the 19th century. So instead, you had a local store owner, in this case in Spadra, California, who was paid a really small commission, maybe $100 a year, to pass out letters to customers as they came into the store. And overwhelmingly, these locations were not necessarily dedicated full-time to the postal system itself. You had to, again, graft it onto private places of business. And outside of big cities, this is how the US Post operated. About 95% of post offices in the 1800s were run according to this agency model. This is the engine that allowed the US Post to expand so quickly into all these different places, but then also contract really quickly as well. So instead of setting up these standalone buildings, having an entire government workforce of employees or your own vehicles, for instance, you would pay a commission to a local store owner, a contract to a stagecoach company, and then let's say that that area of the country maybe relied on mining, dries up, you're able to then withdraw from there relatively quickly. And this has a lot of fascinating implications for how the network operated. In particular, it offers a much different view of the federal government and government institutions than I think a lot of us have in our mind. When I think of the US Post, when I think of other government agencies, I tend to think of a centralized bureaucracy, this kind of top-down system that's centrally managed. And this is much, much different. This is being driven at the local level. And again, it's a kind of different way of envisioning what the state's federal government looked like in the 1800s.
Okay, and so I know, Cameron, a large portion of your book focuses in on the period of the American Civil War and after, and I'm wondering how this post model gets started, since you attribute the success of the US Post to this agency model of organization rather than a more centralized federal bureaucracy reaching out. So how did the agency model of the US Post get started, and when did that begin to happen?
Yep. So the origins of the 1800s postal system really stretches back to the very birth of the country. One of the first major pieces of legislation that new Congress passes is actually the Post Office Act that establishes the postal system. And what's really crucial about this is less the kind of specifics of how it's set up, but more the fact that it puts in place a basic dedication by the federal government of the United States to provide an accessible and affordable mail service to its citizens. And so that means that it's subsidizing things like the transmission of news and newspapers. The historian Richard John has written a really, really important book kind of spelling out this early period of the nation. But it also means that it puts into place this kind of machinery of extending the network into all these different places. So that's one thing when you have 13 states right along the Atlantic seaboard. That starts to be something different over the next 50 years as the United States becomes a continental nation. And as it expands, you see the federal government wrestling with how do you actually send mail, carry letters to all of these distant places, thousands of miles away. But because of this dedication originally to, again, providing an accessible mail service, that's how you have the growth of this really expansive system. And if you think back to that chart that I showed showing the United States all the way up in the corner as this global outlier, that's what it traces back to. This idea that the mail service is a public service provided to all of its citizens, no matter where you live.
So was the East Coast an agency model as well, those original 13 states and increasing? Were those part of this Gossamer network, or did the National Institution of the US Post look very different between the East Coast and the West Coast?
So there were some regional differences. I would say the US West represented the kind of epitome of this unstable, ephemeral network, but it was much more of an urban-rural divide. If you lived in the rural United States, chances are this is what the postal system would look like. If you lived in a city, things look very different. So that, I'd say, the biggest difference. So you oftentimes see rural parts of the South, for instance, southern parts of the network, having a lot of resemblance to, say, places in the Mountain West.
Okay. And were there other Gossamer networks besides the US Post, or did other institutions operate along similar lines as the agency model, thinking about the United States expanding and the expansion of federal power?
Right. And this is actually one of the surprising parts, for me at least, of studying the US Post, was not that the US Post explains everything, but this model that I'm seeing at work here, once you noticed it and picked up how it was operating, I started to see it in a bunch of other areas, especially the federal government. So I'll just name two examples. One would be the US Pension Bureau, which really grew after the US Civil War. And the idea was it was in charge of distributing payments to injured veterans, along with the widows and their dependents who have died. And by the 1890s, you had about close to 1 million people who were receiving pensions from the federal government in some way. And it's taken up about 40% of the federal budget. What was fascinating to me is that if you were trying to administer this system again, all these people spread across a really large area, the federal government is not setting up this really stable, expansive infrastructure to do so. Instead, it is hiring a part-time workforce. Basically takes local doctors and physicians called neighborhood practitioners and pays them a commission or a small fee for evaluating, doing an exam on pension claimants to determine whether or not they deserved a pension or not. And again, this is not a full-time salary position. These are local private actors that the US government is then grafting this public service onto. So that's the agency model at work. US Census would be another example of this. Again, thinking about how do you count millions of people spread across the country? Well, every 10 years or so, they use tens of thousands of census enumerators to fan out across different districts, go door to door, collect information about the nation's inhabitants. And this looked a lot like the agency model of the postal system, right? You were paid a commission based on kind of particular, how many people you counted, how much territory you covered. And in fact, a lot of times postmasters moonlit as census enumerators as well. So there's all these different parts of the federal government that you kind of peel back a layer, really does not look like a centralized bureaucracy at all.
Okay. And before we turn to audience questions, I have just a couple more for you, turning to one of my favorite topics, which is talking to writers about writing. So in this book, you've combined both qualitative and quantitative approaches to tell a very compelling story about the rapid expansion of the US state via the post office. And I'm wondering what the writing process was like for you. What was it like to work in vastly different scales, thinking about the federal government and then zeroing in on particular individuals? And I would really love to hear about your decision in chapter 2 to really talk about the Curtis family, a group of siblings.
Sure. So I think it's a little bit of a misnomer. Sometimes people who do digital history are accused of basically just kind of fetishizing numbers and graphs and charts and tables at the expense of things like narrative or personal experience. And for me, that couldn't be farther from the truth, in the sense that a lot of times some of the biggest insights I had really came from working at a much more local scale in the archives, looking at documents and trying to understand in particular how this massive network that you can see on a map, what did it actually mean for individuals that were living at the time and operating within it, right? What did this actually mean in their lives? And this is when the Curtis family in particular became really important for me. And so this is this really wonderful trove of letters at the Huntington Library in Southern California. And it is a collection of letters that spans about 40 years of 4 orphans who were orphaned in Ohio and then kind of scattered to the winds, but all eventually ended up moving to the Western United States. And in particular, there's a lot of letters from the youngest of the 4, Benjamin Curtis. And this is a picture of Benjamin and his wife, Mary Curtis. And at the time, the 2 of them are living in the Salt River Valley of Arizona Territory. And this is a kind of Google Earth view of what it looks like today, but it's very typical kind of Western landscape, right? Harsh, rugged. This is not necessarily a place you would want to end up. And he talks about they're basically living alone on a ranch. They have no one but their animals for company. And the nearest big town is 30 miles away. But what's remarkable about this and looking at their letters is just how connected they are to the rest of the world. And so again, despite living in the middle of nowhere, he mentions casually that they subscribe to about a half dozen newspapers and magazines, Chicago Daily Tribune, right? National magazines like the American Agriculturalist or the Delineator, a women's magazine. And over the course of all these dozens of letters, you just see them kind of casually again mention what is going through the mail, being sent to them or them sending to other people. You see books, photographs, handkerchiefs, flannel, pins, napkins, money, right? A bundle of San Diego newspapers. So all this stuff is moving through the mail. And then finally, of course, letters. They're receiving letters, they're sending letters, and in particular, letters connecting Benjamin to his older siblings who live in San Diego. His 2 older sisters who he's very close with. They're exchanging letters and they're arriving to him within the span of 5 to 7 days, despite the fact that, again, he is living in the middle of nowhere. And the reason why he's able to stay connected to this larger kind of systems of family, commerce, news, politics is because of this larger network. He has 2 post offices operating within 2 miles of his house. Within 20 minutes, he's able to pick and choose between going to 2 different post offices. This is what it means to have the world's largest, most expansive postal system that's able to expand into all these different super distant and remote areas like the Salt River Valley in Arizona. And so I think tying together those 2 scales of this larger network and system, the experience of what it meant to benefit from that was what kind of put all the dots together for me.
Well, I could keep asking you questions about this all day, but I'm just going to take one more, and then we'll turn it over to Richard and our lovely audience and their questions. So this book is actually not just a book. It's also a website. The website is gossamernetwork.com. And I was wondering if you could tell us about why you decided to work in both print and digital media and what that process was like.
So I wrestled a lot with this, and I remember actually having a conversation with Richard, who was my advisor at the time in graduate school, and we kind of faced a decision crossroads early on in the dissertation about whether we wanted this to be an electronic, all digital version or a PDF that you're going to submit to the Stanford Institutional Repository. We ultimately kind of pragmatically went with the latter approach of submitting a PDF and then eventually turning this into a print book that you can see in Charlotte's background there, right? And I did that intentionally. I wanted this to be a book. I didn't want this to be entirely reliant on a kind of virtual interface. And there are kind of pros and cons to each that I can talk more about. But I also thought it was important to develop some kind of narrative-based and visualization-based story to accompany it. I think a lot of these patterns, I did my best to kind of have static maps in the book that do show this dynamic change over time. When you're talking about something as large, expansive, and fast-moving as the US Post, I think it helps to have this larger, more interactive interface. And so I ended up working with just an incredibly talented designer named Yan Wu, who is actually now at the Wall Street Journal working in their data visualization team, to develop a map-based interface, and this is gossamernetwork.com. And again, it kind of follows the model of almost data journalism, this kind of what's been called scrolly telling narratives, where you can scroll through text here, but then also overlaid with different interactive features that can highlight patterns that are going on in the map. And this is telling more of a chronological story of how the network expanded and what are some of the major patterns over time. And it really is meant as kind of a supplement to the book. And the idea is that you can read the book, understand all the stuff without needing to go to this website. So.
Okay, and that's going to be a really great resource for students too. I'm excited to see how that gets used. So now I will turn it over to Richard, who's going to moderate our audience questions. Thank you, Cameron.
Yeah, I'm going to take the questions partially as they came in, but I'm also going to lump some together if they're very similar questions, so Cameron doesn't have to repeat himself in answering them. And let me start with one about the prevalence of the post office and what it says about government. And the question is, prior to the New Deal, wasn't the post office just about the only contact most citizens had with the federal government, whether in the West or elsewhere?
Right. So I think there is this idea, right, that it is the most expansive arm of the federal government by far. It employs more people than the rest of the the judicial, legislative, and executive branches combined. And if you put it on a map and compare it to other federal institutions, its spatial footprint is just so much more massive. There's about 10 times as many post offices operating in the West in the 1870s, for instance, than all other government institutions put together. So in a real sense, the local post office was your main source of contact with the federal government. But I think the difference here, and what I find really fascinating, is that your source of who the federal government is not this kind of tax collector coming in from Washington, D.C. It is your local store owner. And oftentimes it's different store owners, because I can talk about this later, but the US Post is also highly politicized. And so who is running the post office is changing all the time. And so it's less of a stable entity of kind of like what is the federal government in a way that's very different from what it would become in the 20th century. But yes, generally speaking, your main point of contact would be the post office department.
Okay, let me go to a question which I realize historians sometimes use as a term of art, which is incomprehensible to anybody else. And the question is, define spatial history.
So I'm just having flashbacks to my qualifying exams with Richard when he asked me for the first question to define capitalism. So that was fun. But thank you for that question. So spatial history is, generally speaking, an approach to looking at the past through the lens of space and geography. And so rather than purely focusing on things like change over time, you look at how different patterns that unfold across space shape those larger historical processes. So in the case of the US Post, it would be trying to understand what something like this expansive geographical coverage actually meant for people, rather than just kind of treating it as an abstract network. You stop to consider some of the spatial implications. And oftentimes this can involve digital technology, so mapping things, but it doesn't always have to, right? It can just be more of a critical attention to the ways in which space shape people's lives.
Okay, and another question which starts with your metaphor and goes on from there, which is, I love the metaphor of Gossamer network constantly expanding and contracting. For much of the book, you talk about what patterns the expansion of the network can tell us. I wonder what you see from the opposite. What can we learn or see from the contractions of the network?
Yep, this was also which in particular parts of the Mountain West were so unstable. Places like the Esperanza post office that are disappearing immediately. And when you start to link up the post office records to other kinds of records, you start to realize the extent to which the Western United States in the late 1800s is dependent on this kind of boom and bust economy. It is churning, people are moving everywhere. Resource depletion is happening really quickly. It is a really, really kind of brutal and unstable place to live in many parts of the region. If you look at the postal system, you can kind of use that as a proxy for measuring how unstable different parts of the country are. So again, Mountain West, depending on things like mining, ranching, extractive industries, you're going to see this kind of expansion and contraction happening at a lot higher frequency than something like, New England with a little bit more stable settlement patterns.
Okay, and there's a question about, is there evidence that more robust communication enabled by the Postal Service popularized and accelerated campaigns of westward expansion, manifest destiny, et cetera?
Right. So I think what's interesting here is that when you look at something like the US Post that is so large, so expansive and kind of everywhere, it can be hard to pin down what is a causal factor. And so I would say the US Post is not causing any of this to happen at all, but it's playing this kind of facilitating role, an accelerating role behind it. And so again, when we're thinking about campaigns of westward expansion, manifest destiny, like the questioner asked, oftentimes you will see the Post expanding alongside something like military roads or routes in the West, and then being used as a justification by the US Army, for instance, to launch campaigns against Native people as a way of kind of protecting the mail along these lines. And then it's also, of course, ferrying all these letters out to places like California, as all these migrants are moving there for the gold rush. So again, being able to stay connected to the Eastern United States while you're moving west, I think really does play a big role in helping people make that decision again to occupy stolen native land.
Okay. Let me combine a couple of questions here. And one is, did the US invent the agency model, or did it adopt the model from another nation in Europe? I mean, I'll even add in here, is it something like tax farming in France? And coupled with that, was the telegraph system also an agency model?
Right. So what's interesting to me was I tried to do some international comparison, and what I found was the agency model is, there's elements of it that are being used in other countries, but it really does set at least the postal system in the United States apart from other countries. And this can go back again to that beginning of the idea of providing a publicly available and accessible mail service. In a lot of other countries, actually, the US Post was used as a revenue generating machine for the national government. That was not the case in the United States. And so in other countries, there was much more of this kind of careful top-down centralized expansion. You'd have a administrator go out into the field, let's say, and evaluate whether or not an area needed it. This is what happened in Russia, a similar system in Great Britain, and also in Japan. That did not happen in the American West. If people moved somewhere and wanted a post office, they'd write a petition, they'd send it to their congressperson or the post office department, and chances are they would have a post office up and running in a couple of months. So that kind of separated the two, at least for me here. And then the second question about the telegraph system. I think the telegraph system did actually operate in a similar way, in that there were local telegraph agents. And what was really interesting to me was oftentimes you would see a local postmaster also operating as a Western Union telegraph agent. So you could go to the post office, you could send a letter, and you could also send a telegram. But I think the main difference here is that the telegraph system was not a public communications infrastructure. And this had a lot of implications. So if you're Western Union, you're a private company, you're trying to generate a profit, that means you are not necessarily going to extend a telegraph line to these tiny little mining camps in the middle of nowhere, because there's just not enough demand to justify it. Second, they also charge different fees based on how far the telegram is going. Whereas the US Post, starting in the 1860s, gets rid of distance entirely and says you can send a letter anywhere in the country, 3,000 miles away, for 3 cents. That, I think, is a bigger difference between the private telegraph system and the public mail service than the kind of agency model behind it. And actually, at the time, the telegraph was referred to as the rich man's mail. It was much, much, much more expensive to send a telegram. And if you're kind of an ordinary American, most of the time you are not actually going to be using the telegraph.
And here's a question about the post office and popular culture, right? So I learned about the post office services from 1940s, 1950s Hollywood Westerns. Did they get it right?
I'm really tempted to just be like, yes, and just see Richard's face here. But no, as with most things in Hollywood, they didn't quite nail it. So I think there's a couple different things here. One is, again, this idea of romantic Westerns focusing on individual people, right? So the heroic cowboy or stagecoach being chased by bandits or Indians or something like that. The reality on the ground was probably a lot more boring. Most mail kind of traveled without incident. There were definitely, instances of attacks on the mail stages, but I think that's vastly overplayed. And then the second piece of this would be, I think, probably the Pony Express, which I'm guessing most of you, if you've heard of the Western postal system, immediately think of the Pony Express. And the Pony Express was this really, really fascinating historical episode. Operated from 1860 to 1861. So it operated for about 18 or 19 months total before shutting down. It was basically this kind of publicity stunt by a private company to win a government mail contract. And it charged really, really high rates to carry the mail much faster than the US Post itself. So in the span of about 12 days to cross the continent. But again, it operated for a very small amount of time, but since then it has taken on this hugely important symbolic role in the national imagination. I kind of joke that's probably one of the most successful branding projects of all time. But
and before I turn to a couple of digital questions, one more question here. Can you talk a bit about the Post and indigenous populations, particularly just, the Louis Warren in his book on the Ghost Dance points out that the ghost dancers communicated by mail.
Right. So there's kind of a two-piece role that the US Post plays in relation to Western tribes in particular. One would be this larger system that really facilitates white settlers occupying native land. But then the second one, which Richard just gestured to, is that on reservations that kind of developed by the 1880s, you see native people actually embracing the Post as a means of communicating with not only loved ones, friends, family, and kin on other reservations, but also sending petitions to the federal government to try to improve their conditions on the reservation. And there's actually a really wonderful book by the historian Justin Gage that just came out that I'd highly recommend, that goes into all sorts of wonderful detail about the ways in which native tribes in the West adapted literacy and the Post in particular.
And here I'm going to combine a couple of digital questions. Are there any particular open repositories for historical data that you would recommend for somebody curious to play around with some of it? No specific topic in mind, just curious to see what data is out there. And if the first one's about the data, then this is one about the tools. In digital history, there's often a lot of emphasis in the tools, so shiny, so neat, and the ways in which you can answer our historical questions in exciting ways. I wonder if you could talk about the reverse. How did the use of digital history change the questions you asked and the subsequent conclusions?
I actually think those two questions are pretty related, for me at least. And so I do teach digital tools to students all the time. And what I found again and again is oftentimes the way in which students learn the best about how to use tools is to actually apply them to questions or problems that they find interesting, and whether that's historical or otherwise. I'm not a huge fan of just giving students kind of a prepackaged historical data set to play around with, in part because I think the impetus to learn some of these really complex things, I think, needs to come from some kind of question. And that doesn't have to be a really, really specific research question necessarily, but I think it does help to have that in mind. So in my case, for instance, the use of digital history to kind of change the questions I asked, it was really a result of working with this data set and kind of realizing, like, wait a second, you put this on a map, there's a post office everywhere. And not only that, but these post offices are disappearing, they're expanding, right? They're popping up, right? So working with that data then prompted that larger question of what is happening here? How is this thing even working? Because if you just looked at this, it would be like, this is a disaster. And so that forced me then to go back to the archives and try to understand a little bit more about like what the role of all of these individual dots actually meant for a local community. And that's where I think the digital side of things actually led me back to the archives rather than the other way around.
Okay, and I'm interested to learn that 95%, my screen's changing here on me. I'm interested to learn that 95% of the federal post offices were run on the agency system in the mid to late 19th century, which seems to imply that the USPS was always has always really been decentralized and in some sense privatized. I'd assume that recent conservative efforts to privatize the USPS were relatively new. Consequences of deregulationist, Reaganite, neoliberal, Trumpian thinking about big government being a problem. Can you talk more about recent conservative efforts to privatize the USPS? What do you think of the future of this federal institution and its continued place and meaning in American life?
Yep. So I get this question a lot, and I think it is important to establish that kind of modern attitudes towards the U.S. Post and the ways in which the U.S. Postal Service in particular has become a little bit of a divisive topic on this partisan way was actually not the case until the 20th century. Well through the 1800s and even into the 1900s, the U.S. Post was seen as largely a public service, and it ran a deficit the vast majority of the years. And there was some hand-wringing about, deficits and fiscal conservatism, but generally speaking, politicians from both sides of the aisle wanted this expansive postal network. And what I see in these congressional debates from, let's say, the 1870s and 1880s, really interestingly, is that rather than Democrats fighting against Republicans about, postal expansion, you have these sectional alliances where people from rural parts of the country, both Democrats and Republicans, are kind of joining forces to say, well, no, of course we need to keep expanding the post into all these rural areas. That starts to change in the second half of the 20th century. And in particular, the 1970 was this kind of defining point where there was a commission that studied the US Post and then recommended establishing the modern US Postal Service. And this has been called by one historian kind of jackalope private-public institution. So effectively what it means is that it cut off taxpayer funding from the mail. It required it to be fiscally self-sufficient. This was a means of trying to implement kind of more modern business techniques and innovations into the post. But at the same time, it was written into this organization act that it still had to provide mail service to different parts of the country, in particular rural parts of the country, regardless of the cost. And again, you see this tension between the US Post trying to operate as a more of a kind of a business, a private business model, versus this older model of providing a public service. And in the early 2000s, you saw Congress also then require the US Post to pre-fund retiree benefits. It's this kind of bureaucratic mechanism, but basically it means that it cut off the US Post from the kind of financial flexibility that private business would have, and means that we have had deficits piling up at the US postal system for decades now, kind of uninterrupted. There's a lot of different reasons for this that I'm happy to get into, but that kind of partisan jockeying over the future of the US Post did not really take place in the 1800s. Instead, what you had earlier, which I find really interesting, you're seeing this resurgence now, is a really partisanship within the US Post itself. And so for a long time, the US Post was the biggest source of patronage positions. So you see the party that was in charge of the presidency using it as a means to dole out these government jobs to loyal party followers. And both sides did this, and that was just kind of the way in which politics operated. That's a different kind of political mechanism than the kind of partisan divide today over what the Post should be.
Okay, and then there's a question that's about the letters themselves. Do you see a relationship between literacy and letters sent through the post? Is there a gender dimension here?
There's not necessarily a gender dimension, at least that I've been able to see. There is these really interesting ways in which how people access the system is a little bit different. And David Henkin, a historian, has written an interesting book about urban post offices in particular, and the rise of the post office as this kind of public space. And there's all sorts of fretting in the 19th century about what does it mean if a woman or a girl is able to go into these kind of public spaces where men might be swearing and drinking and spitting. And what you see end up happening is oftentimes there will be two separate windows for men and for women. And oftentimes letters will be advertised waiting for you under a ladies list and a men's list. But besides that, the ways in which different people use the US Post, as far as I can tell, there isn't as much of a large distinction there.
And how has the advent of web-based communications changed the post office's physical presence in the US, particularly in remote regions where the post was often the resident's sole contact, as it was in Salt River in Arizona.
Yep. So the number of letters sent by Americans, first-class mail, peaked in 2001, and it has fallen off a cliff since then. So the rise of email, electronic communication, the web has been absolutely devastating for the balance sheet of the US Post. And that also means that trying to maintain such a large network is becoming harder and harder and harder. And I think what's really interesting is you start to see in the last 5 to 10 years or so, USPS is actually starting to experiment with these older models of providing service. So again, rather than this salaried employee at a government building that most of us are familiar with, they're experimenting with something called village post offices, where they will pay a convenience store owner to offer some minimal mail service within a store in, let's say, rural Washington state, something like that. So that's kind of ironic to me to see this like older model coming back into play in the 21st century. But yeah.
And did the post office allow all citizens, regardless of color, ethnicity, religion, or gender, to use the postal service?
So officially, yes. What's actually also interesting is that during Reconstruction, so this period after the Civil War, Republicans, the party in the North, is in charge of the executive branch. And what you see is they actually start giving federal jobs to African Americans, in particular Union veterans from the Civil War. And starting from that point on, the US Post, especially in the 20th century, becomes a major engine for a kind of African American middle class lifestyle, especially in large cities, places like Washington, DC. The flip side of this is that the Post is super localized. So again, if you're going into a local store, your store owner is in charge of the postal system. That means they have a lot of power over how you interact with the system. And if you're living in the rural South in the 1890s, for instance, there's all sorts of kind of unofficial ways in which your access to the mail might be restricted. Or if you're living on a Indian reservation where the government agent in charge of the reservation is also the postmaster, there's a whole level of surveillance that's going on as well about how you're able to use the post.
And we're coming to the end of the hour, and there's a bunch of other questions that I haven't been able to get to. Some of them repeat earlier questions, others Cameron might be able to answer online. But I'll end with a final question by a prominent spatial historian who I won't name here. And it's one that you touched on, but you can amplify your answer. Do you find that the monograph works well with spatial history, or are there other ways in which you would choose to share your work? In other words, are we stuck with an old form of publication that does not work well with newer methods and technologies?
I'll give an appropriately mealy-mouthed answer, which is that I think it depends on the projects. There are definitely spatial projects out there that fundamentally, I think, need to be told through an interactive, web-based presence of some kind. There are also others that I think can be told in wonderful ways in a print monograph. And I think some of the most important works of spatial history actually do not rely on any kind of fancy mapping technology, but can be told in this more narrative prose approach. But I will say, I think having especially worked with Yan Wu and borrowing a little bit from the field of data journalism, I think that's an area in which the form is really way ahead of a lot of what historians are doing, myself included. I think things like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, a lot of the digital based storytelling that they're doing is really incredible. And I think they're doing it in ways that aren't just kind of mimicking a print monograph or their print newspaper style in their form, but really adding something new.
And again, I'd like to thank both Charlotte and Cameron, but I'd also like to thank the audience for their engagement and their questions. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. And I'll end with a final announcement. We're, I think, exactly on time here, that the Lane Center next event is an author talk with Shanti Sekaran for her book, Lucky Boy, which explores the experience of migration and motherhood. And this is going to be an event that's going to be in partnership with the Palo Alto Libraries. And you all should be able to get notification if you're on the Lane Center list. If you're not, you should probably join the Lane Center list. So thank you very much to everybody concerned. And this will be the end of the session.